The rain hammered against the hospital windows as I pulled my scrubs tighter around my shoulders, exhaustion weighing down every step toward the parking garage. My shift had been brutal, 3 back-to-back codes, an elderly woman who reminded me so much of Mrs. Rossini, and now I was already 20 minutes late picking up Emma from the overnight sitter. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting eerie shadows that made my already frayed nerves jump at every sound. I fumbled for my car keys, hands trembling from caffeine withdrawal and pure exhaustion. 12-hour shifts were killing me, but the overtime pay meant Emma could stay in her preschool, meant we could keep our tiny apartment in Queens, meant I didn't have to choose between her medical insurance and groceries. The weight of being 28 and completely alone in this world pressed down on my chest like a lead blanket. My ancient Honda Civic groaned to life after 3 attempts, the engine coughing like it might give up entirely. The drive home through Queens was a blur of streetlights bleeding through rain-streaked windshields. My mind already 3 steps ahead to Emma's bedtime routine. She'd been having nightmares lately, something about monsters in the closet that no amount of nightlights could chase away. My heart clenched thinking about her small face, all wide green eyes and trembling bottom lip when she climbed into my bed at 3 a.m. The babysitter, Mrs. Chen, met me at the door with knowing eyes. "She's been asking for you for 2 hours," she said softly, handing me Emma's tiny backpack. Wouldn't eat dinner, just kept looking at the door. Emma appeared in the hallway like a little ghost, her strawberry blonde hair mussed from sleep, clutching the worn teddy bear that had seen better days. "Mama," she whispered, and my heart shattered into a million pieces the way it did every time I saw how much she needed me. "Hey, baby girl," I murmured, scooping her up despite my aching back. She wrapped her small arms around my neck, and I breathed in the scent of her strawberry shampoo mixed with that unique smell that was purely Emma. "Did you have a good day with Mrs. Chen?" She nodded against my shoulder, but I could feel the tension in her small body. "The monsters came back in my dreams. Mama, they were scary and loud." As I carried her up the 3 flights to our apartment, Emma's weight felt both heavy and precious in my arms. Our building wasn't much peeling paint in the hallways, a radiator that clanged all winter, neighbors who played music too loud, but it was ours. Inside our small 1-bedroom, I'd created a sanctuary for Emma, fairy lights strung around her corner of the living room where her twin bed sat, drawings she'd made covering the refrigerator, picture books organized in milk crates I painted rainbow colors. Bath time was a struggle with Emma clinging to me, afraid to close her eyes even to rinse the shampoo from her hair. I found myself humming without thinking, a melody that had been stuck in my head for weeks now. It had started after Mrs. Lucia Rossini had passed away. She'd been one of my patients in the geriatric ward, a tiny Italian woman with the kindest eyes and the saddest stories. "What's that song, Mama?" Emma asked as I toweled her hair dry. "Just something I learned from a friend," I said. Though friend felt like the wrong word for the relationship I'd had with Mrs. Rossini. She'd been alone, no family visitors during her 3-week stay. Just an elderly woman who spoke about her son in fragments, how proud she was of him, how much she missed him, how she hoped he'd forgive her someday for leaving. After Emma brushed her teeth and climbed into her little bed, she looked up at me with those enormous green eyes that could convince me to do anything. "Mama, will you sing the pretty song? The one you were humming?" I hesitated. Mrs. Rossini had taught me the lullaby during her last week, when the morphine had made her drift between past and present. She gripped my hand with surprising strength and whispered the words in a mixture of English and Italian, making me promise to remember it. "For when you have babies who can't sleep," she'd said. "Music heals the scared parts of our hearts." I began to sing softly, the melody flowing from some deep place in my chest. "Luna piena, stella bright, guard my baby through the night. Soni dolci, dreams so sweet, make tomorrow's sunrise complete. When the shadows start to play, Mama's love will chase away. Emma's eyelids grew heavy as I continued the haunting melody, my voice filling our small apartment. The Italian words felt foreign on my tongue, but somehow right, like they'd been waiting inside me all along. I sang about moonlight and stars, about protection and love that transcended distance and time. Mrs. Rossini had told me it was a song her mother had sung to her, and her grandmother before that, passed down through generations of women who understood that sometimes the only weapon against darkness was a mother's voice. As Emma finally drifted off to sleep, her breathing evening out into the peaceful rhythm of childhood, I continued humming the melody. I moved to our small kitchen to prepare my own meager dinner, leftover soup and crackers, when I realized I was still singing. The windows were open despite the October chill because our apartment got stuffy, and my voice carried out into the night air of Queens. I was completely unaware that 3 stories below, a man in an expensive Italian suit had stopped walking to his black Mercedes, his entire body going rigid at the sound drifting down from my window. I was unaware that Julian Rossini, 35-year-old heir to one of New York's most powerful crime families, stood frozen on the sidewalk, his hand gripping the car door handle so tightly his knuckles had gone white. I was unaware that the lullaby flowing from my lips was a song his mother had created just for him, sung only in the privacy of their home, never shared with another living soul, a song he hadn't heard since she disappeared from his life 15 years ago, leaving behind only questions and a hollow ache in his chest that no amount of power or money could fill. As I finished the last verse and moved away from the window to check on Emma one more time, Julian remained motionless on the street below, his sharp mind racing through possibilities and memories. His mother's voice echoed in his head, mixing with the strangers above, creating a symphony of longing and confusion that threatened to undo the careful control he'd spent decades building. The next morning arrived with the persistent buzz of my alarm at 6 a.m., though I'd been awake for the past hour listening to Emma's soft breathing and planning the impossible mathematics of our weekly budget. Rent was due in 3 days, Emma's prescription needed refilling, and my car was making that grinding noise again that probably meant expensive repairs. I calculated and recalculated in my head, moving numbers around like puzzle pieces that would never quite fit together. Emma was unusually cheerful at breakfast, humming the lullaby while she ate her cereal. "Mama, I didn't have scary dreams last night." The pretty song made them go away. My heart squeezed with a mixture of relief and love so intense it almost brought tears to my eyes. "I'm so glad, baby girl." Music has special powers, doesn't it? After dropping Emma at preschool, her teacher, Miss Rodriguez, commenting on how much brighter she seemed, I made the familiar drive to Mount Sinai Hospital for another 12-hour shift. The October morning was crisp, the kind of New York autumn day that made you remember why people loved this impossible city despite everything it demanded from you. I was walking through the hospital's main entrance, already mentally preparing for the controlled chaos of the geriatric ward when I felt the unmistakable sensation of being watched. The back of my neck prickled with awareness, and I turned to scan the lobby filled with the usual morning crowd, families visiting loved ones, medical staff in various colored scrubs, delivery people wheeling supplies. That's when I saw him. He stood near the information desk like he owned the space around him, and maybe he did. Tall, easily over 6 feet, with dark hair that looked like it cost more to maintain than I made in a month. His suit was charcoal gray and fit him like it had been sewn onto his body by angels. The kind of tailoring that whispered of wealth so old and deep it didn't need to announce itself. But it was his eyes that stopped me, cold dark brown, almost black, and focused on me with an intensity that made my breath catch in my throat. He was beautiful in the way that dangerous things often were, all sharp angles and controlled power. His jaw was strong with just a hint of stubble that suggested careful grooming rather than carelessness. There was something predatory about the way he stood perfectly still while the world moved around him, like he was the center of gravity and everything else was just orbiting. When our eyes met across the lobby, I felt a jolt of electricity shoot through my body that had nothing to do with the hospital's fluorescent lighting. He began walking toward me with purposeful strides, and I noticed how other people unconsciously stepped out of his way, like some primitive part of their brains recognized alpha status and reacted accordingly. I should have kept walking. Should have hurried to the elevator and disappeared into the maze of hospital corridors where I belonged. Instead, I stood frozen, watching this stranger approach with my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. "Excuse me," he said when he was close enough that I could see the gold flecks in his dark eyes, could smell the expensive cologne that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget. His voice was deep and controlled, with just the slightest hint of an accent that suggested European education mixed with New York sophistication. "I apologize for approaching you like this, but I need to ask you something important." Up close, he was even more overwhelming. The fabric of his suit looked like it could buy my car twice over. His shoes were Italian leather so perfectly polished they could serve as mirrors. And there was a gold watch on his wrist that probably cost more than I made in the past 6 months. Everything about him screamed wealth and power, but it was the way he looked at me, like I was the only person in the crowded hospital lobby. Like whatever he needed to ask was the most important thing in the world that made my knees feel unsteady. "I what?" I managed, my voice coming out smaller than I intended. I clutched my purse strap tighter, suddenly aware of how I must look to him tired from too many double shifts. My scrubs wrinkled from the morning rush, my hair pulled back in a hasty ponytail. We were from completely different worlds, this man and I couldn't imagine what he could possibly want with someone like me. Last night, around 11 p.m., you were singing. His eyes never left mine, and I noticed they were rimmed with thick black lashes that should have been illegal on someone so masculine. A lullaby. Italian and English mixed together. Luna piena, stella bright. My blood turned to ice water in my veins. How could he possibly know that? How could he know the exact words, the exact time? 1,000 explanations raced through my mind, none of them good. Was he some kind of stalker? Had he been watching our apartment? Was Emma in danger? I don't know what you're talking about, I lied, taking a step backward. My hand fumbled in my purse for my phone, ready to call security, ready to run, ready to do whatever it took to protect my daughter from whatever this man represented. Please, he said, and something in his voice made me pause. Beneath the authority and control, there was something raw, something vulnerable that didn't match his intimidating exterior. I'm not here to hurt you. I just need to know where you learned that song. It's very important to me. There were people everywhere, nurses hurrying past, visitors consulting maps, the normal morning chaos of a busy hospital, but suddenly it felt like we were alone in a bubble of tension and electricity. His presence was magnetic in a way that defied logic, drawing me in even as every rational part of my brain screamed warnings. I learned it from a patient, I heard myself say, though I hadn't meant to answer him at all, an elderly woman. She passed away last month. Something flickered across his face, pain so quick and sharp that I almost missed it. His jaw clenched, and for a moment, the careful control slipped enough that I caught a glimpse of something deeper. Grief, loss. The kind of pain that lives in your chest and colors everything else. What was her name? He asked quietly, and his voice had changed. Less commanding, more human, more broken. Lucia Rossini, I whispered, and watched as this powerful, dangerous-looking man went completely still. The color drained from his face like someone had pulled a plug. His hands, which had been relaxed at his sides, curled into fists. For a moment, he looked like he might collapse. Might break apart right there in the hospital lobby, and some instinct I didn't understand made me want to reach out and steady him. Lucia, he repeated, and the way he said her name was like a prayer and a curse all wrapped together. She taught you that song? Yes, I said, my voice barely audible over the hospital's ambient noise. She said it was something her mother taught her and her mother before that. She made me promise to remember it, to sing it for children who couldn't sleep. He closed his eyes for a long moment. And when he opened them again, they were bright with unshed tears that he was fighting to control. She was my mother, he said simply, and those 4 words contained so much pain that I felt my own eyes begin to water in response. Oh my God, I breathed, pieces clicking together in my mind. Mrs. Rossini had talked about her son, always in fragments, always with such love and regret. She'd shown me a picture once, old and worn from handling, of a young man with dark eyes and a serious expression. This man, 20 years younger, but unmistakably the same person. She talked about you, I said without thinking. She was so proud of you. She missed you so much. His control cracked then, just for a moment, and I saw the boy he'd been underneath the intimidating exterior. The child who'd lost his mother and never quite recovered from it. Where is she buried? He asked, his voice rough with emotion. St. Mary's Cemetery in Queens, I said gently. Plot 47B, I visit sometimes. To leave flowers. He stared at me like I'd just told him I could fly. Like the idea of a stranger caring enough about his mother to visit her grave was incomprehensible. You visit her? She was alone, I said, suddenly feeling defensive. No one should be alone. Something shifted in his expression then, a warmth that transformed his entire face. What's your name? He asked softly. Sarah, I said. Sarah McKenna. Sarah. The way he said my name made my stomach flutter in ways I hadn't felt in years. I'm Julian. Julian Rossini. Even as he introduced himself, I was becoming aware that this conversation had drawn attention. A hospital security guard was hovering nearby, clearly recognizing that Julian didn't belong in the normal ecosystem of the hospital. Other people were giving us a wide berth, some shooting curious glances in our direction. Julian, I repeated and saw him react to the sound of his name in my voice. Your mother ... she talked about you all the time. She said you were a good man, that you took care of people. She said that? His voice was barely a whisper. She said you had your father's strength but her heart, I continued, remembering the elderly woman's exact words. She said she hoped you'd forgive her someday for leaving, that she'd done it to protect you from something. But she never told me what. Julian's face went through a series of expressions: surprise, pain, understanding, and finally something that looked like relief. She was protecting me, he said quietly, more to himself than to me. All these years I thought, I need to get to work, I said reluctantly, glancing at my watch. I was already 10 minutes late, and Nurse Patterson would have my head if I held up morning report again. But I'm glad I could tell you about your mother. She was a wonderful woman. Wait, he said as I turned to go. Please, can I? Would you have coffee with me? Sometime when you're not working? I'd like to hear more about her final weeks. Every rational part of my brain said no. This man was clearly wealthy, clearly powerful, clearly from a world I didn't understand. He could be dangerous. He could be married. He could be 100 different kinds of trouble that a single mother with barely enough money to make rent couldn't afford. But when I looked into his eyes, I saw grief that matched my own. I saw a son who'd lost his mother and never got to say goodbye. I saw someone who needed to hear that she'd been loved and cared for in her final days. I work tomorrow night, I found myself saying. I could meet you Thursday afternoon. There's a coffee shop on 42nd Street near the hospital. Cafe Luna, he said immediately. 2 o'clock? I nodded, wondering what I was getting myself into, but unable to refuse the hope in his voice. 2 o'clock. Thank you, Sarah, he said, and the gratitude in his voice was so genuine it made my chest ache. You don't know what this means to me. As I walked toward the elevators, I could feel his eyes following me. When I turned back just before the doors closed, he was still standing there watching me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Something between gratitude and hunger, between relief and anticipation. The elevator doors closed and I leaned against the back wall, my heart still racing. I had no idea what I'd just agreed to, but something told me my carefully ordered life was about to become very complicated. On the geriatric ward, the familiar chaos of morning medications and patient care provided a welcome distraction from the surreal encounter in the lobby. But even as I checked vitals and distributed pills, part of my mind kept drifting back to Julian Rossini, the way he'd looked when I mentioned his mother, the expensive clothes that marked him as someone from a completely different world, the intensity in his dark eyes that had made me feel like he could see straight through to my soul. You seem distracted today, observed Dr. Martinez during our mid-morning break. Everything okay at home? Fine, I said quickly, not ready to explain an encounter I didn't even understand myself. Emma had nightmares, so I didn't sleep much. Dr. Martinez nodded sympathetically. He had 3 kids of his own and understood the special exhaustion that came with single parenthood. Speaking of which, how are you managing with the rent increase? I know things have been tight. My stomach clenched. The building's management company had raised our rent by $300 a month starting December 1st. I'd been trying not to think about it, but the reality was becoming impossible to ignore. Even with overtime, even with careful budgeting, the numbers just didn't work. We'll figure something out, I said, forcing a smile. We always do. But as the day wore on, the weight of financial pressure combined with the strange encounter with Julian created a knot of anxiety in my chest that wouldn't loosen. By the time my shift ended at 7 p.m., I was emotionally and physically drained. Emma was unusually quiet during dinner, picking at her mac and cheese while I tried to inject energy into my voice that I didn't feel. How was school today, baby girl? Good, she said, but she kept glancing at me with those perceptive green eyes that missed nothing. Mama, are you sad? Not sad, sweetheart. Just tired. Will you sing the pretty song again tonight? I nodded, already looking forward to the peaceful ritual that had become our new bedtime routine. As I helped Emma brush her teeth and get into her pajamas, I found myself humming a lullaby without conscious thought. Once again, our windows were open to combat the stuffiness of our small apartment. Once again, my voice carried out into the October night as I sang Emma to sleep. And once again, Julian Rossini stood on the sidewalk below, listening to his mother's song performed by a stranger who had shown her kindness in her final days. But tonight, instead of confusion and shock, he felt something else entirely. A sense of rightness, as if pieces of a puzzle he'd been trying to solve for 15 years were finally falling into place. His mother had chosen this woman, this Sarah McKenna, to carry on something precious. She'd passed down the song that had once been just theirs, creating a connection between his past and his present that felt like more than coincidence. As Sarah's voice faded and the apartment windows went dark, Julian made a decision that would change both their lives forever. Tomorrow, he would learn everything there was to know about Sarah McKenna. And then he would find a way to protect her the same way she had protected his mother's memory. Because Julian Rossini didn't believe in coincidences, and he'd learned long ago that the universe rarely offered second chances. But standing on that Queens sidewalk, listening to echoes of his childhood drift down from a stranger's window, he knew that somehow his mother had given him exactly that. The coffee shop Julian had suggested, Caf Luna, turned out to be the kind of place I usually walked past without entering. Everything about it whispered expensive sophistication, from the imported Italian marble countertops to the crystal chandeliers that looked like they belonged in a palace rather than a coffee shop. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, I could see businessmen in $1,000 suits conducting meetings over tiny porcelain cups, women who looked like they'd stepped off magazine covers picking at delicate pastries. I stood outside for a full 5 minutes, second-guessing my decision to come at all. My best jeans and sweater, which had seemed appropriate when I'd gotten dressed, now felt shabby and out of place. The other patrons visible through the windows all had that particular polish that came with money, real money, not the paycheck-to-paycheck existence I knew. But I'd promised Julian I'd be here, and despite every logical reason to walk away, something about his grief had touched a part of me I usually kept carefully protected. His mother had been alone in her final weeks, except for the hospital staff who cared for her. If sharing those memories could bring him some peace, then I could endure an hour of feeling out of place. The moment I stepped inside, I spotted Julian at a corner table, and my breath caught in my throat. Yesterday's expensive suit had been replaced by dark jeans and a cream-colored cashmere sweater that probably cost more than my monthly rent, but somehow made him look more approachable, more human. The harsh fluorescent lighting of the hospital had done nothing to soften his angular features, but here in the warm golden glow of the cafe, he was devastating. He stood when he saw me, and I noticed how several other patrons, particularly women, tracked his movement with barely concealed interest. But his attention was entirely focused on me, those dark eyes taking in my appearance with an intensity that made my cheeks flush. "Sarah," he said, and hearing my name in his deep voice sent an unexpected shiver down my spine. "Thank you for coming. Thank you for suggesting somewhere so ... I gestured helplessly at the opulent surroundings. "Over the top." He finished with a slight smile that transformed his entire face. "I suppose I'm used to it. Please sit. Can I order you something?" I glanced at the menu displayed in elegant script on a marble board and nearly choked when I saw the prices. $18 for a coffee drink, $25 for a small pastry. These weren't prices for people like me. "Just coffee?" I said quickly. "Black coffee is fine." Julian signaled to a waitress with the kind of subtle gesture that spoke of a lifetime of being catered to. Within moments, she appeared at our table, all smiles and deference. "Mr. Rossini," she said warmly, clearly recognizing him as a regular customer. "Your usual?" "Please, and for the lady ... He looked at me questioningly. "She said black coffee," the waitress said, her tone noticeably cooler when addressing me directly. I bristled slightly at the obvious dismissal, but forced myself to remain polite. "Actually," Julian said smoothly, his voice taking on an edge that made the waitress straighten, "bring us the Ethiopian blend, prepared in the French press. 2 cups and a selection of the pastries, the chocolate croissants, the lemon tarts, and whatever else Giuseppe recommends today. Of course, Mr. Rossini." Right away, as the waitress hurried off, I stared at Julian in surprise. "You didn't need to. She was rude to you," he said simply, his dark eyes flashing with something that looked like anger. "That's unacceptable." There was something in his tone, a quiet authority that suggested he wasn't used to being disobeyed, that made me study his face more carefully. The expensive clothes, the deference of the staff, the way he handled the waitress's rudeness with such swift efficiency. Pieces of a puzzle I hadn't even realized I was solving began clicking together. "You're not just wealthy," I said slowly. "Are you?" His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "What makes you say that? The way people look at you. The way they respond to you. It's not just money, it's something else. Something that makes them ... I search for the right word. Careful. For a moment, I thought he might deflect or change the subject. Then he leaned back in his chair, studying me with those penetrating dark eyes. You're very observant. That's not an answer. No, he agreed. It's not. He was quiet for a moment, seeming to weigh his words carefully. My family has business interests in New York. Import, export, real estate, some restaurants. We've been here for 3 generations. It was a careful, diplomatic answer that told me absolutely nothing while confirming my suspicions that there was much more to Julian Rossini than met the eye. The way he'd phrased it, business interests, 3 generations, had the rhythm of something rehearsed. Something designed to satisfy curiosity without revealing anything substantial. The coffee arrived, along with an elaborate spread of pastries that looked too beautiful to eat. The waitress was all smiles now, clearly having been instructed to provide exceptional service. As she arranged everything perfectly on our table, I caught her sneaking glances at Julian with unmistakable appreciation. This is too much, I protested as she finally left us alone. It's nothing, Julian said, pouring coffee from the French press with practiced ease. Please, tell me about my mother. The subject change was smoothly executed, but I could tell it was also a deflection from questions about his family business. Still, the genuine emotion in his voice when he mentioned his mother made me decide to let it go. For now, she was in the geriatric ward for 3 weeks, I began, accepting the delicate porcelain cup he offered. The coffee was extraordinarily rich and complex with notes I never tasted in my usual deli coffee. Pneumonia that developed into complications. She was lonely, no visitors except the priest who came twice. Julian's hands tightened around his cup. No visitors? She talked about you constantly, though. She had a picture of you in her wallet. You looked so young in it. I was 20 when that was taken, he said quietly. Just before she ... Left? He nodded, his expression darkening. One day she was there, the next morning she was gone. No note, no explanation. Just gone. I studied his face, seeing the pain that 15 years hadn't diminished. She said she had to leave to protect you. She never explained what from, but she said it was the hardest thing she'd ever done. Protect me, he repeated, and there was something bitter in his voice. I spent years thinking she'd abandoned me, that she'd chosen someone else over her family. No, I said firmly, remembering the elderly woman's tears whenever she spoke of her son. Whatever her reasons, it wasn't that. She loved you desperately. She carried that picture everywhere, showed it to anyone who'd listen. She was proud of the man you'd become, even though she couldn't be part of your life. Julian was quiet for a long moment, staring into his coffee cup like it might contain answers to questions he'd been asking for years. When he looked up, his eyes were bright with unshed tears. Tell me about the song, he said. When did she teach it to you? I smiled, remembering the frail woman who gripped my hand with surprising strength. It was 3 days before she passed. She'd been asking for her son you, and when I told her I couldn't reach you, she got upset. That's when she taught me the lullaby. She was asking for me? Constantly. She kept saying she needed to tell you something important, that there were things you needed to know. I tried to find contact information for you, but there was nothing in her records except an old address that turned out to be a demolition site. Julian's expression shifted to something that looked like self-recrimination. I had people looking for her for years. Private investigators, police contacts. No one could find any trace of her after she left. She was using her maiden name, I offered, Lucia Benedetti, and she was paying cash for everything, the apartment, medical bills, everything. She said she couldn't leave a trail. Couldn't leave a trail. The words seemed to echo with significance for Julian. Because she was protecting me. She made me promise to remember the song, I continued. She said it had been passed down through generations of women in her family and that someday I might meet someone who needed to hear it. She made me sing it back to her 3 times to make sure I had it right. And you sing it to your daughter now? I nodded, taking a sip of the incredible coffee. Emma's been having nightmares. The song seems to help. Emma, Julian repeated, and something in his tone made me look up sharply. My daughter, she's 4. Just the 2 of you? There was a careful neutrality in his voice that somehow felt loaded with meaning. Her father isn't in the picture, I said, feeling defensive without quite knowing why. Julian nodded, and I caught a flash of what looked like satisfaction in his dark eyes. That must be difficult. Raising a child alone in the city. We managed, I said, the same phrase I always used when people pointed out the challenges of single motherhood. Emma's worth every sacrifice. I'm sure she is. He reached for one of the pastries, placing it on a small plate and sliding it toward me. Please eat something. You look like you don't eat enough. The casual observation stung because it was true. Groceries were often the first thing I cut from the budget when money was tight. But it also suggested a level of attention to my appearance that made my stomach flutter in ways that had nothing to do with hunger. I eat fine, I said, but I accepted the pastry gratefully. The first bite was a revelation, buttery, flaky, with dark chocolate that melted on my tongue like sign. Tell me about yourself, Julian said, settling back in his chair with his coffee. What made you become a nurse? It was such a normal question. The kind of small talk that happened on any first date, though this wasn't a date, I reminded myself firmly. But something about the way he asked it, like my answer genuinely mattered to him, made me want to give him more than a surface response. I wanted to help people, I began, then stopped. That sounds like a pageant answer. The truth is, my mother was sick when I was growing up, cancer, and I spent a lot of time in hospitals. The nurses were the ones who made it bearable. They were the ones who explained things when the doctors were too busy, who brought extra blankets when she was cold, who let me stay past visiting hours because they knew I was scared to leave her alone. Julian's expression softened. Did she ... double quotes, she died when I was 17, I said, surprised by how easily I was sharing something so personal. Senior year of high school. I decided that night that I wanted to be the person who makes impossible situations a little more bearable. That's a beautiful reason to choose a profession. What about you? I asked, deflecting from the emotion in his voice. What made you choose the family business? His smile was sharp and humorless. I didn't choose it. It chose me. Before I could ask what that meant, his phone buzzed on the table. The name Anthony flashed on the screen, and Julian's entire demeanor changed. His jaw tightened, his shoulders tensed, and suddenly the relaxed man who'd been asking about my career was replaced by someone harder, more dangerous. Excuse me, he said, answering the phone. This is Julian. I couldn't hear the other side of the conversation, but I watched Julian's face grow increasingly tense. His responses were short, clipped. When? How many? Handle it. I'll be there in 20 minutes. When he hung up, he looked at me with what appeared to be genuine regret. I'm sorry, Sarah, I have to go. There's a situation that requires my attention. Of course, I said, though I felt a stab of disappointment that surprised me with its intensity. Julian signaled to the waitress, who appeared immediately with a check. I didn't see the total, but he placed several $100 bills on the table without counting them. That's way too much, I protested. It's fine. He stood, and I noticed how his movements had become more controlled, more predatory. Whatever had been discussed in that phone call had activated something in him, something that reminded me that despite his kindness to me, Julian Rossini was not a man to be underestimated. Sarah, he said, his voice taking on that note of quiet authority I'd heard in the hospital. Can I see you again? The smart answer was no. Everything about this man screamed complicated: the expensive clothes, the deference of strangers, the mysterious family business, the way a single phone call had transformed him from charming companion to something much more dangerous. I was a single mother with barely enough money to make rent. I couldn't afford to get involved with someone like Julian Rossini. But when I looked into his dark eyes and saw the vulnerability he was trying to hide beneath the intimidating exterior, I heard myself say, I'd like that. His smile was swift and genuine, transforming his face completely. Tomorrow night? I'll pick you up after your shift. I don't know if that's... Please, he said, and the word was soft, almost pleading. I'd like to hear more about my mother. And I'd like to know more about the woman who was kind to her when she had no one else. The raw honesty in his voice undid me completely. Okay, I whispered. Julian reached into his pocket and pulled out a business card, writing something on the back before handing it to me. That's my private number. If you need anything at all, you call me. Day or night? I took the card, our fingers brushing in the exchange. The contact sent electricity shooting up my arm, and from the way Julian's eyes darkened, he felt it too. I should go, I said, suddenly aware that we'd been leaning toward each other across the table. that the space between us had become charged with something I wasn't ready to name. Of course, but he made no move to leave, just stood there looking at me like he was trying to memorize my face. I gathered my purse and stood, acutely aware of how his height dwarfed me, how his presence seemed to fill the space around us. "Thank you for the coffee. And for listening to my stories about your mother. Thank you for sharing them with me," he said seriously. "You've given me something I thought I'd lost forever." As I walked toward the exit, I could feel his eyes following me. At the door, I turned back to find him still standing by the table, watching me with an expression that was part gratitude, part longing, and part something else entirely, something that made my heart race and my common sense scream warnings I was increasingly inclined to ignore. The walk back to the hospital where I'd left my car gave me time to process what had just happened. I'd agreed to see Julian Rossini again, despite every logical reason to stay away. Despite not knowing what kind of business interests required him to carry enough cash to tip a waitress $300. Despite the way people looked at him with a mixture of respect and fear that suggested his family's influence extended far beyond simple wealth. I pulled out the business card he'd given me. The front was elegant, understated, Rossini Enterprises with an address in Manhattan that I was pretty sure was one of those buildings where apartments cost more than most people's annual salaries. On the back, he'd written his phone number in bold, confident handwriting along with a simple message, "For anything you need, Jay." As I drove home through Queens, I found myself thinking about the way he'd looked when I told him his mother had been asking for him. The pain in his dark eyes when he'd realized she'd left to protect him, not to abandon him. The careful way he'd avoided direct answers about his family business while somehow making me feel like I was the most fascinating person he'd ever met. I was so lost in thought that I almost missed the black Mercedes following 3 cars behind me. Almost missed the way it had been there when I'd left the cafe, had stayed a consistent distance behind me through 4 turns and 2 lane changes. Almost convinced myself it was paranoia born from too many crime shows and too much time spent in the city. But as I pulled into my apartment building's parking lot and watched the Mercedes slow as it passed, I caught a glimpse of the driver, a large man in a dark suit who looked like he could break someone in half without breaking a sweat. The kind of man who might work for a family with mysterious business interests that required careful discretion. As I climbed the 3 flights to my apartment, Emma's excited chatter about her day at preschool washing over me like a balm, I tried to push away the growing certainty that by agreeing to see Julian Rossini again, I'd stepped into a world far more complicated and dangerous than I'd ever imagined. But even as warning bells rang in my head, I couldn't forget the way he looked at me in the cafe, like I was precious. Like I was worth protecting. Like I was someone who mattered. And despite every rational thought screaming that I was making a mistake, part of me was already counting the hours until I would see him again. That evening, as I sang the lullaby that had started it all, I was unaware that Julian stood once again on the sidewalk below. But tonight he wasn't alone. Anthony Torino, his closest friend and the man who handled security for the Rossini family, stood beside him, his massive frame tense with disapproval. "This is dangerous, Julian," Anthony said quietly, his voice barely audible over the traffic. "Getting involved with civilians. Especially her. She took care of my mother," Julian replied, his eyes fixed on the window where Sarah's voice drifted down like a benediction. "When she had no one else, this woman showed her kindness. That doesn't mean you owe her anything. And it sure as hell doesn't mean you should be getting personally involved." Julian turned to his oldest friend and Anthony took an involuntary step back at the cold fury in his boss's eyes. "My mother spent 15 years alone because she was protecting me from a war I didn't even know was happening. She died alone, Anthony. No family, no friends from her old life. Just hospital staff and a nurse who visited her grave because she thought no one else would. Julian, this woman," Julian continued, his voice taking on the deadly quiet that had made hardened criminals confess their sins, "is under my protection now. Anyone who threatens her daughter, threatens so much as a hair on their heads, answers to me personally. Are we clear?" Anthony sighed, recognizing the tone that meant Julian's mind was made up. "Clear, boss, but you should know there's already interest. Uncle Vittorio's been asking questions about your activities. And the Morettis have been sniffing around, wondering why you've been spending time in Queens." Julian's jaw clenched. His Uncle Vittorio had always been ambitious, always looking for ways to undermine Julian's position as head of the family. and the Morettis were old enemies, constantly probing for weaknesses they could exploit. "Double the security on her building," Julian ordered. "Discreet surveillance, but I want to know if anyone so much as looks at her wrong." "And Anthony?" "Yeah, boss?" "Find out everything there is to know about Sarah McKenna. Her background, her finances, any ex-boyfriends or family members who might cause problems. I want a complete picture." "Already on it," Anthony said with a slight smile. "Should have a full report by tomorrow morning." As the two men walked away from Sarah's building, neither noticed the figure watching them from the shadows across the street. Marco Moretti had been following Julian for weeks, looking for leverage, looking for weakness. And now it seemed he'd found it. A beautiful nurse with a 4-year-old daughter who had somehow captured the attention of Julian Rossini. A woman who could be used, threatened, hurt in ways that would bring the untouchable Mafia prince to his knees. Marco smiled as he pulled out his phone to call his father. The Moretti family had been waiting years for an opportunity like this. And now, thanks to a lullaby sung in the darkness of Queens, they finally had their weapon. Inside her apartment, Sarah tucked Emma into bed, completely unaware that her simple act of kindness to a dying woman had set in motion events that would change her life forever. Unaware that 3 floors below, 2 families with a decades-old feud were already beginning to circle her like sharks drawn to blood. All she knew was that tomorrow night she would see Julian Rossini again. And despite every warning her rational mind was screaming, she was looking forward to it more than she'd looked forward to anything in years. The next morning brought what Anthony Torino had promised, a complete dossier on Sarah McKenna that landed on Julian's desk with the weight of revelation and the sting of recognition. As he read through the carefully compiled information, Julian felt a familiar burn in his chest, the same protective fury that had driven him to take control of his family's empire in the first place. Sarah Elizabeth McKenna, 28 years old, born in Buffalo, New York. Mother deceased from breast cancer when Sarah was 17. Father unknown listed as NA on the birth certificate. No siblings. Married at 22 to David Chen, divorced 2 years later after what hospital records suggested was a pattern of domestic violence. One child, Emma Rose McKenna Chen, age 4, father listed as David Chen, but no contact or support provided in over 2 years. Current employment, Mount Sinai Hospital, geriatric ward, $42,000 annual salary. Previous employment included 2 other hospitals where she'd left after budget cuts eliminated her positions. Current debts, $23,000 in medical school loans, $8,000 in credit cards, mostly medical expenses for Emma's asthma treatments. Rent, $2,100 per month, recently increased to $2,400, effective December 1st. Bank account balance as of yesterday, $847.32. Julian set the papers down and leaned back in his leather chair, looking out at the Manhattan skyline from his office on the 40th floor of the Rossini building. The numbers painted a picture of someone living on the absolute edge, someone for whom a car repair or medical emergency could mean homelessness, someone who was one crisis away from losing everything. The protective instinct that had been simmering since he'd first heard her voice singing his mother's lullaby now roared to life with an intensity that surprised him. Sarah McKenna was vulnerable in ways she probably didn't even realize. And in Julian's world, vulnerability attracted predators like blood attracted sharks. His intercom buzzed. "Mr. Rossini? Your Uncle Vittorio is here to see you." Julian's jaw tightened. He'd been expecting this visit, had seen the wheels turning in his uncle's calculating mind during the last family meeting. Send him in. Vittorio Rossini entered the office with the swagger of a man who believed he deserved more power than he'd been given. At 55, he was still handsome in a cold, sharp way. His silver hair perfectly styled and his suits custom-tailored, to hide the soft belly that came from too many expensive dinners and not enough honest work. "Julian," Vittorio said, settling into the chair across from the desk without invitation. "I hear you've been spending time in Queens. Interesting change of scenery for you. Is there a point to this visit, Uncle?" Julian's voice carried the quiet authority that had made grown men confess their sins, but Vittorio was family, and family dynamics followed different rules. "The point is that people are talking, the Morettis specifically. They're wondering why the head of our family is suddenly interested in ... Vittorio consulted a small notebook. "A single mother who works as a nurse. They're wondering if you've developed a weakness that could be exploited. Julian's." Hands remained perfectly still on his desk, but anyone who knew him well would have recognized the dangerous calm that preceded violence. And what did you tell them? Nothing, of course. Family business stays within the family. Vittorio leaned forward, his cold blue eyes glittering with ambition. But Julian, you have to understand how this looks. You're 35 years old, unmarried, no children. The family needs security, needs to know the bloodline will continue. This infatuation with some nobody nurse. Careful. The word was spoken so quietly it was barely audible, but it carried enough menace to make Vittorio stop mid-sentence. Very careful how you speak about her. Vittorio sat back, his expression shifting as he recognized he'd pushed too far. I'm not attacking the woman, Julian. I'm simply saying that your personal life has become a matter of family interest. Perhaps it's time to consider a more appropriate alliance. Maria Benedetto has been asking about you, and a connection between our family and the Benedettos would strengthen both organizations. Julian knew. Maria Benedetto, a cold, beautiful woman from a powerful Sicilian family who viewed marriage as a business transaction and love as a weakness to be exploited. She was exactly the kind of woman his uncle would consider appropriate, connected, calculating, and completely without warmth or genuine emotion. I'll consider your input, Julian said dismissively, turning his attention back to the papers on his desk. Julian, the conversation is over. Uncle. Vittorio's face flushed with anger at the dismissal, but he knew better than to push further. As he reached the door, he turned back with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Just remember, nephew, in our world, affection is often seen as weakness. And weakness gets people killed. After his uncle left, Julian sat in silence for several minutes, processing the threat that had been delivered with familial courtesy. The Morettis were circling, looking for leverage. His uncle was positioning himself to take advantage of any perceived weakness in Julian's leadership. And somewhere in Queens, a woman who had shown kindness to his dying mother was going about her day, completely unaware that she'd become a target simply by existing in his orbit. Julian reached for his phone and dialed Anthony's number. I want security tripled on Sarah McKenna, he said without preamble. And I want surveillance on Vittorio. Something tells me my uncle's concern for family business is more personal than he's admitting. Already done, boss. But Julian ... There's something else you should know. David Chun, her ex-husband, filed a petition yesterday to regain custody of Emma. Claims he's turned his life around and wants to be a father to his daughter. Julian felt ice water flow through his veins. According to the file, David Chung was a gambling addict with a history of domestic violence who hadn't paid child support or made contact with his daughter in over 2 years. The timing of his sudden paternal interest was suspiciously convenient. Find out who's backing him, Julian ordered. None like Chun don't file custody petitions without someone providing the lawyer fees and the motivation. On it. Should I handle it directly? No, Julian said after a moment's consideration. This needs to be done carefully. Sarah can't know we're involved. But make it clear to Mr. Chun that his petition will be unsuccessful and that any further harassment of his ex-wife and daughter will be met with extreme prejudice. Understood, boss. Julian hung up and returned to Sarah's file, studying the photograph Anthony had included. She was beautiful in the way that took your breath away slowly, without artifice or calculation. Her smile was genuine, her eyes warm with the kind of compassion that couldn't be faked. She was everything that was good and clean in a world that had shown Julian very little of either. And now, because she'd been kind to his mother, because she'd sung a lullaby to a dying woman who'd had no one else, she was in danger. Julian made a decision that would have consequences he couldn't yet foresee. Sarah McKenna was under his protection now, whether she knew it or not. And anyone who threatened her would learn why Julian Rossini had earned his reputation as a man who protected what was his with lethal efficiency. But first, he had a dinner to get through. And somehow, he had to find a way to keep Sarah safe without revealing the true extent of the danger she was in or the depth of his growing obsession with the woman who had given his mother comfort in her final days. As evening approached, Julian found himself changing clothes 3 times, a level of indecision that would have amused Anthony if he'd been there to witness it. The man who could negotiate multi-million-dollar deals without breaking a sweat was nervous about dinner with a nurse from Queens. Finally settling on dark jeans and a black cashmere sweater casual enough not to intimidate her, expensive enough to suggest success without flaunting wealth. Julian drove through the October evening toward Mount Sinai Hospital. The autumn air was crisp, carrying the scent of dying leaves and the promise of winter, and the city lights were beginning to twinkle in the gathering darkness. Sarah emerged from the hospital at exactly 7 p.m., and Julian felt his breath catch in his throat. She changed from her scrubs into a simple black dress that hugged her curves without being too revealing, her blonde hair loose around her shoulders instead of pulled back in the practical ponytail she wore for work. She was beautiful in a way that made him forget about family obligations and business complications and focus entirely on the woman walking toward his car. "You look beautiful," he said as she slid into the passenger seat of his Mercedes and was rewarded with a blush that painted her cheeks pink. "Thank you. You clean up pretty well yourself." Her voice was slightly breathless, and Julian wondered if she was as affected by his presence as he was by hers. "I thought we might go somewhere quieter than yesterday," Julian said, pulling into traffic. "I made reservations at a little Italian place in Little Italy. Family-owned, excellent food, and private enough for conversation. What he didn't mention was that Nona's kitchen was owned by the Rossini family, that the staff had been vetted and were completely loyal, and that the private dining room he'd reserved was regularly swept for surveillance devices. He also didn't mention the 2 security cars following at a discreet distance, or Anthony positioned at a table near the kitchen with a clear view of all entrances. "That sounds perfect," Sarah said, settling back in the leather seat. "I love Italian food, though I have to admit most of my experience has been with the pasta special at Tony's Diner near my apartment." Julian felt another surge of protectiveness at the reminder of her financial situation. According to Anthony's research, Sarah had been living on pasta and canned soup for the past month, saving every possible penny for Emma's needs. Tonight, he was going to make sure she ate a proper meal, even if he had to find creative ways to ensure she didn't feel uncomfortable about the expense. "Tell me about Emma," he said as they drove through the city. "What's she like?" Sarah's entire face lit up when she talked about her daughter. "She's incredible. Smart, funny, stubborn as hell, stubborn as heck. She wants to be a doctor when she grows up, but also a princess and a dinosaur hunter. She's been asking about the man who taught me the pretty song." "What did you tell her?" "That he was the son of a friend, and that his mother had wanted him to know how much she loved him." Sarah glanced at Julian's profile, studying the strong line of his jaw and the way his hands gripped the steering wheel. "She wants to meet you." Julian felt something warm and unexpected bloom in his chest. "I'd like to meet her too. If that's something you'd be comfortable with." Sarah seemed to struggle with something. "I should probably mention that I don't usually introduce Emma to men I'm spending time with. She's been through enough upheaval in her short life." "Of course," Julian said gently, though privately he was pleased that she didn't make a habit of bringing men around her daughter. "We can take things as slowly as you need." Nona's kitchen was exactly as Julian had described, a small, family-owned restaurant tucked between a bakery and a bookstore on a quiet street in Little Italy. The exterior was modest, with warm light spilling from the windows and the kind of atmosphere that promised excellent food and no pretensions. Giuseppe Torino, Anthony's cousin and the restaurant's owner, greeted Julian at the door with the warmth reserved for favored family members. "Julian, welcome back. Your usual table is ready." The private dining room was small and intimate, with exposed brick walls, candles flickering on a table set for 2, and a view of the narrow street through lace-curtain windows. It felt like stepping into someone's grandmother's dining room rather than a restaurant, and Julian watched Sarah visibly relax as they were seated. "This is lovely," she said, accepting the wine list Giuseppe offered. "Much more my style than yesterday's place." "I thought you might prefer it." Julian watched her scan the wine list and saw her eyes widen slightly at the prices. "The house wine here is excellent. Giuseppe's family has been making it for generations." Sarah nodded gratefully, and Julian made a mental note to have Anthony ensure that tonight's bill would be handled discreetly. The last thing he wanted was for her to feel uncomfortable or indebted to him. So Sarah said once they'd ordered and been served a bottle of rich, ruby red wine that tasted like sunshine and tradition. "Tell me about your mother when she was young. What was she like?" Julian smiled, the tension he'd been carrying since his uncle's visit beginning to ease. "She was light. That's the word that comes to mind when I think of her. She had this way of making everything seem possible, like the world was full of adventures just waiting to be discovered." "She mentioned that once," Sarah said softly. She said you had inherited your father's strength, but that she hoped you kept her sense of wonder. Did she really say that? Word for word, she was so proud of you, Jillian. Even though she couldn't be part of your life, she followed everything about you that she could. She knew about your business successes, your reputation for being fair but firm. She said you'd become the man she'd always known you could be. Julian felt emotions he'd buried years ago rising to the surface. His mother had been watching him from a distance, proud of his accomplishments even though she couldn't share in them. I spent so many years angry at her for leaving. I thought she'd chosen something else over her family. What changed your mind? Julian was quiet for a moment, considering how much truth he could share without revealing the darker aspects of his family's business. I learned that the world she left behind was more dangerous than I'd realized when I was 20. That sometimes protecting someone means making sacrifices that seem incomprehensible from the outside. Sarah studied his face with those perceptive green eyes. You speak like someone who's had to make similar choices. Perhaps I have, Julian admitted, meeting her gaze steadily. Perhaps we all have to choose between what we want and what's best for the people we love. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of their appetizers antipasto that looked like a work of art and tasted even better. Julian watched Sarah take her first bite of prosciutto that cost more per pound than she made in a week, and felt a deep satisfaction when her eyes widened with pleasure. "This is incredible," she said, and the genuine delight in her voice made Julian want to fly to Italy and import the entire delicatessen just to see her smile like that again. Giuseppe sources everything directly from Italy. His grandfather started this place in 1952, and they've never compromised on quality. It shows. Sarah took a sip of wine and studied Julian across the candlelit table. "Can I ask you something personal?" "Of course. Yesterday, when your phone rang, you changed completely, like someone had flipped a switch. What kind of business requires that level of intensity?" Julian had been expecting this question, had prepared for it, but looking into Sarah's honest, open face made him wish he could give her the complete truth. The kind that comes with significant responsibilities. "I employ a lot of people, and their livelihoods depend on my decisions. When problems arise, they need to be handled quickly and decisively. It wasn't a lie exactly, but it wasn't the whole truth either. Julian did employ hundreds of people in legitimate businesses as well as the family's traditional enterprises. He was responsible for their welfare and their family's security. But the problems that required his immediate attention weren't usually about quarterly reports or labor disputes." "That's a lot of pressure for one person," Sarah said gently. "It's what I was born for," Julian replied automatically, then paused, realizing how that sounded. "I mean, it's what I've been trained for my entire life. Family business has a way of choosing you rather than the other way around. Do you ever think about doing something else? Something that's just yours?" The question caught Julian off guard. No one had ever asked him what he wanted to do with his life apart from family obligations. He stopped, considering. "I used to want to be an architect. I love the idea of creating something beautiful and permanent, something that would last long after I was gone." "What stopped you?" "Life," Julian said simply. "My father died when I was 25. Someone had to take over." "I'm sorry," Sarah said, and the compassion in her voice was so genuine that Julian felt something crack open in his chest. "That must have been overwhelming." "It was. But it also gave me purpose. Everything I do now is about building something that will last, creating security for the people who depend on me." Their main courses arrived, osso buco for Julian and risotto with wild mushrooms for Sarah, and the conversation shifted to lighter topics. Julian found himself genuinely relaxing for the first time in months, charmed by Sarah's quick wit and dry sense of humor. She told him stories about her patients, about Emma's latest obsessions with dinosaurs and space exploration, about the small moments of joy that sustained her through difficult times. "You're an optimist," Julian observed as she finished a story about teaching Emma to identify constellations from their apartment building's roof. "I have to be," Sarah said simply. "When you're responsible for a little person who believes the world is full of magic and possibilities, you can't afford to be cynical, even when life keeps proving that belief wrong." Sarah was quiet for a moment, her fork tracing patterns in her risotto, especially then. "Emma deserves to believe in magic for as long as possible. The world will show her its harsh reality soon enough." Julian felt a fierce protectiveness surge through him. If he had his way, Emma McKenna would never have to learn about the harsh realities of the world. She would grow up believing in magic and possibilities, protected from the darkness that men like Julian dealt with so that people like Sarah could continue to see light. What about you? Sarah asked, pulling Julian from his thoughts. Do you believe in magic? Julian looked across the table at this beautiful woman who had shown kindness to his dying mother, who worked impossible hours to provide for her daughter, who somehow managed to maintain hope and humor despite everything life had thrown at her. I'm starting to, he said quietly. The look that passed between them was charged with something Julian didn't want to name. Something that felt like possibility and danger all wrapped together. Something that made him want to forget about family obligations and business complications and focus entirely on the woman whose presence was quickly becoming essential to his peace of mind. Sarah, he began, not sure what he intended to say. His phone buzzed with a text from Anthony. Emergency. Need you now? Julian closed his eyes, cursing silently. I'm sorry, he said, genuine regret in his voice. I have to go, Sarah said, though he could see disappointment flicker across her face. I understand. No, you don't, Julian said, standing and pulling out his wallet. But someday I hope I can explain. He left enough cash on the table to cover dinner for 10 people. Kissed Sarah gently on the cheek, feeling her sharp intake of breath at the contact, and left her sitting in the candlelight, wondering what kind of man she was falling for. Outside the restaurant, Anthony was waiting with the engine running and an expression that meant someone was about to have a very bad night. What is it? Julian asked as he got into the car. David Chun. He didn't take our warning seriously. He grabbed Emma from preschool an hour ago. Julian felt the world go red around the edges. Where is he? We're tracking him. But Julian, this has Moretti fingerprints all over it. Chun didn't come up with this plan on his own. As they raced through the night toward a confrontation that would show Sarah exactly what kind of world she'd stumbled into, Julian made a promise to himself. After tonight, David Chun would never be a threat to Sarah or Emma again. And the Morettis would learn why challenging Julian Rossini's protection was the last mistake they'd ever make. But first, he had to save a 4-year-old girl who'd become precious to him simply because she was loved by the woman who'd sung his mother's lullaby. The warehouse in Brooklyn where David Chun had taken Emma was the kind of place where bad things happened to innocent people. Isolated, surrounded by abandoned lots with multiple escape routes and no witnesses. Julian studied the building through binoculars from the driver's seat of Anthony's SUV, his mind calculating angles and possibilities while his heart hammered with a fear he hadn't felt in years. 6 exits, Anthony reported through his earpiece. Chun's car is parked by the south entrance. Heat signatures show 3 adults and 1 small person on the 2nd floor, northwest corner. The small person, is she moving? Julian's voice was deadly calm, the tone that made hardened criminals confess their sins. Yes, active heat signature, not distressed positioning. She's okay, boss. Julian closed his eyes and allowed himself one moment of relief before the cold fury took over completely. Who's with Chun? 2 unknowns, but the body language suggests they're Moretti muscle. This isn't just about custody, Julian. They're using the kid as bait. Julian had reached the same conclusion. Marco Moretti was too much of a coward to face Julian directly, but he was smart enough to know that threatening a child would draw Julian into an exposed position. What Marco hadn't counted on was that Julian Rossini had been protecting what mattered to him since he was old enough to hold a gun. Teams in position? Julian asked, checking his own weapon for the 3rd time. North and south entrances covered. Snipers on the adjacent buildings. We're ready, boss. Julian took a deep breath, centering himself in the calm that preceded violence. Somewhere in that warehouse was a 4-year-old girl who trusted her mother to keep her safe. A little girl who sang lullabies and believed in dinosaurs and magic. A child who'd become important to him because she was loved by the woman who'd shown kindness to his dying mother. Remember, Julian said into his earpiece, the priority is the girl. Everything else is secondary. No shots unless you have a clean target and 0 risk to the child. Julian moved toward the warehouse with the fluid grace of someone who'd learned violence as a second language. The south entrance was guarded by a single man who went down quietly, Anthony's military training making short work of amateur muscle. Inside, the building was a maze of concrete and shadows, the kind of place where sounds echoed and disappeared unpredictably. Julian climbed toward the second floor, every sense hyper-alert. He could hear voices above Chun's whiny tone mixed with rougher accents he recognized as Marathi enforcers. But underneath it all, he could hear something that made his chest tight with rage. A little girl crying for her mother. The northwest corner room had one entrance and 2 windows facing an alley. Julian positioned himself outside the door, listening to the conversation within. "She won't stop crying," Chun complained. "You said this will be quick." "Boss wants the girl to stay put until Rossini shows up," replied a voice. Julian recognized as Tommy Moretti, Marco's cousin and a man with a reputation for enjoying violence a little too much. "Then we negotiate." "Negotiate for what?" "I just want my daughter back." Tommy laughed, a sound devoid of humor. "You're stupider than you look, Chun. This ain't about custody. This is about teaching Julian Rossini that nobody's untouchable." Julian had heard enough. He kicked in the door with controlled fury, moving into the room with his gun drawn and his attention focused on the 3 men who'd made the mistake of threatening a child under his protection. David Chen was exactly what Julian had expected, a weak man in his 30s with the soft look of someone who'd never faced real consequences for his actions. The 2 Moretti enforcers were bigger, more dangerous. But they'd made the tactical error of positioning themselves too close to Emma, limiting Julian's options for clean shots. Emma herself was huddled in the corner, her small face streaked with tears but her green eyes blazing with defiance that reminded Julian heartbreakingly of her mother. She looked up when Julian entered, and something in his face must have reassured her because her crying quieted to small hiccups. "Julian Rossini," Tommy Moretti said with a grin that showed too many teeth. "Right on time. We were just having a conversation with Mr. Chen here about family values. Let the girl go." Julian said quietly, his gun trained on Tommy while his peripheral vision tracked the other enforcer's movements. "This is between you and me. See, that's where you're wrong. This is about you learning some humility. Learning that your protection don't mean shit when we can get to the people you care about." Julian felt ice water flow through his veins. The Morettis had just confirmed what he'd suspected. They'd been watching him, had identified Sarah and Emma as leverage. Which meant this wouldn't end with just saving Emma. It would end with the complete elimination of the threat. "Uncle Julian?" Emma's small voice cut through the tension in the room. "Mama said you might come." Julian's heart clenched at being called Uncle Julian, at the trust in her voice despite the circumstances. "That's right, sweetheart. I'm here to take you home to Mama." "Ain't gonna be that simple," the second enforcer said, shifting position. Julian moved faster than thought, his shot taking the man in the shoulder and spinning him away from Emma. In the same fluid motion, he dove toward the little girl, scooping her up and rolling behind an overturned table as return fire splintered the air where he'd been standing. "You okay, baby girl?" Julian whispered, his body curled protectively around Emma. She nodded against his chest, her small arms wrapping around his neck with complete trust. "I knew you'd come. Mama sings about brave princes, and you're just like one." Julian felt something fundamental shift in his chest. This child, this brave little girl who'd faced down 3 dangerous men and still believed in princes and happy endings, had just claimed him as family. Had just made him responsible not just for her safety, but for preserving her faith that the world contained more light than darkness. "Anthony," Julian said into his earpiece, "move in. North entrance, 2nd floor. 3 tangos, 1 civilian child secured." The next few minutes were controlled chaos as Anthony's team moved through the warehouse with military precision. The wounded enforcer was secured, Tommy Moretti was taken down with non-lethal force, and David Chen found himself on his knees with zip ties around his wrists and a very clear understanding of how badly he'd miscalculated. "Daddy?" Emma looked over Julian's shoulder at the man who'd helped terrorize her. "Why did you take me away from Mama?" David Chen couldn't meet his daughter's eyes. I thought I was trying to help." Julian stood slowly, Emma still in his arms, and walked over to where Chen knelt. When he spoke, his voice carried the quiet authority that had made him the youngest head of a crime family in New York history. "David Chen," Julian said softly, "you will sign papers tomorrow relinquishing all parental rights to Emma McKenna. You will never contact her or her mother again. You will leave New York and never return. If you violate any of these conditions, if you so much as think about Sarah or Emma McKenna, I will find you. Do you understand?" Chen nodded frantically. finally understanding the kind of man he'd allowed himself to be manipulated by the Morettis into threatening. Good. Julian handed Emma to Anthony, who accepted the little girl with the gentle confidence of someone who'd helped raise his younger siblings. Take her outside. I'll be along shortly. Julian turned to Tommy Moretti, who was conscious but secured on the warehouse floor. Tell your cousin Marco that this was his one warning. The next time anyone in your family threatens what's mine, there won't be a conversation. There won't be negotiation. There will just be consequences. Very permanent consequences. Outside the warehouse, Emma was chattering excitedly to Anthony about her adventure, her 4-year-old resilience already bouncing back from trauma that would have broken adults. Julian marveled at her strength, at the way she'd faced down danger and emerged with her spirit intact. She's tough, Anthony observed, adjusting Emma's position in his arms. Gets that from her mother, I guess. Her mother, Julian said with sudden realization. Christ, Anthony, she doesn't know. Sarah's going to be worried sick when Emma doesn't come home from preschool. Already handled, boss. I had Maria call the school and Sarah's apartment. Told them Emma was picked up by family for an impromptu ice cream trip, would be home by 8. Julian checked his watch. 7:30, just enough time to get Emma home and figure out how to explain to Sarah that her daughter had been kidnapped because of her association with him and that it would happen again if they continued to see each other. Uncle Julian? Emma's voice interrupted his dark thoughts. Are you really a prince? Mama says princes are very brave and protect people they love. Julian looked into green eyes so much like her mother's, and realized that whatever happened next, this child had changed something fundamental in him. I try to be sweetheart. I try to protect the people who matter to me. Do Mama and I matter to you? The question, asked with such innocent directness, hit Julian like a physical blow. Yes, he said quietly. You matter very much to me. Good, Emma said with satisfaction. Because I think Mama needs a prince. She tries to be brave all by herself, but sometimes I hear her crying at night when she thinks I'm asleep. As they drove through the Brooklyn night toward Queens, Julian wrestled with an impossible choice. He could walk away from Sarah and Emma, ensuring their safety but leaving them vulnerable to future threats from anyone who wanted leverage against him. Or he could stay, accepting responsibility for their protection while knowing that his presence in their lives would forever mark them as targets. Looking at Emma's trusting face in the rearview mirror, Julian knew he'd already made his choice. Sarah McKenna had shown kindness to his dying mother and given him something he'd thought lost forever. Avora Akoma had shown kindness to his dying mother and given him something he'd thought lost forever. Connection to the woman who'd shaped him before the family business had claimed him completely. And Emma had just claimed him as family, had called him Uncle Julian and trusted him to be her prince. Julian Rossini had spent his entire adult life taking responsibility for things beyond his control. Tonight, he would accept one more, the safety and happiness of a woman and child who'd become more precious to him than he'd thought possible. But first, he had to convince Sarah that the man she was falling for was worth the danger that came with loving him. And somehow, he had to find a way to protect them both without destroying the innocence that made them so worth protecting in the first place. Sarah was pacing the length of her small living room for the 100th time when she heard footsteps in the hallway. The preschool had called at 5 p.m. to say Emma had been picked up by family, but Sarah didn't have any family. Her landlord, Mrs. Chun David's aunt, had mentioned something about a playdate, but the details had been vague and Sarah's attempts to reach David had gone straight to voicemail. Panic had been building in her chest for 2 hours. When the knock came at her door, firm and authoritative, Sarah rushed to answer it, her heart hammering with relief and residual fear. She yanked open the door expecting to see David with Emma, maybe looking sheepish about poor communication. Instead, she found Julian Rossini holding her daughter like he'd been doing it all his life. Emma's small arms wrapped around his neck and her face bright with excitement rather than trauma. "Mama," Emma called out, reaching for Sarah with grabby hands. "Uncle Julian saved me from the scary men." Sarah felt the world tilt sideways. "Uncle Julian? Scary men? What? May I come in?" Julian asked quietly, and Sarah noticed for the first time that his expensive sweater had a small tear in it and there was something that looked like concrete dust in his dark hair. "We need to talk." Sarah stepped back wordlessly, her mind struggling to process the scene. Julian set Emma down gently, and she immediately ran to her toy box, chattering about her adventure, like it was a field trip rather than whatever had actually happened. "What's going on?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Where has she been?" "The school said family picked her up, but we don't have any family, and David's not answering his phone." "David took her," Julian said simply, his dark eyes watching Sarah's face carefully. "She's safe. She was never in any real danger. But we need to discuss some things." Sarah felt her knees give out, sinking onto her couch as the implications hit her. "David took her? But why?" "He hasn't seen her in 2 years, hasn't even called." "He was being paid?" Julian said, settling into the chair across from her with fluid grace. "By people who wanted to use Emma to get to me." "Get to you?" Sarah's voice rose, and she forced herself to lower it, glancing at Emma, who was happily arranging her stuffed animals. "What does any of this have to do with you?" Julian was quiet for a long moment, seeming to weigh his words carefully. "Sarah, my family's business... It's complicated. There are people who see anyone close to me as a potential target, a source of leverage." "What kind of business?" Sarah began, then stopped as pieces clicked together in her mind. The expensive clothes, the deference of strangers, the way he'd handled the rude waitress with such swift authority. The mysterious phone calls that transformed him from charming companion to something much more dangerous. "Oh my God," she breathed, the blood draining from her face. Your family is... double quotes. Yes," Julian said quietly, neither confirming nor denying her unspoken suspicion. "And because you've been seen with me, because Emma was in my care tonight, you're both at risk." Sarah looked over at her daughter, who was making her stuffed dinosaur fight her teddy bear while humming the lullaby that had started this whole situation. Emma looked happy, untraumatized, completely unaware that she'd been used as a pawn in some kind of power play. "She called you Uncle Julian," Sarah said numbly. "She did." Julian's voice was soft, and when Sarah looked at him, she saw something vulnerable in his dark eyes. "I hope that's acceptable to you." "Acceptable?" Sarah felt hysteria building in her chest. "My daughter was kidnapped because I had coffee with you, and you're asking if it's acceptable that she sees you as family?" "Sarah, no." Sarah stood up, pacing again as anger replaced shock. "No, this is insane. I don't care how charming you are, how much you loved your mother, how good you are with Emma. I can't. We can't be part of whatever world you live in." Julian stood as well, his presence filling the small room. "I understand your fear. Do you?" Sarah turned to face him, her green eyes blazing. "Do you understand what it's like to get a call saying your child was picked up by family when you don't have any family? Do you understand what it's like to spend 2 hours imagining every terrible thing that could happen to the most important person in your world?" "As a matter of fact," Julian said quietly, "I do. Because those 2 hours were the longest of my life, too." Something in his tone made Sarah pause. "What?" "I said those 2 hours were the longest of my life. Knowing Emma was in danger, knowing it was because of me... I've never been more terrified in my life." Sarah stared at him, seeing truth in his dark eyes. "You were scared too." "Terrified?" Julian admitted. "Sarah, I know this is overwhelming. I know it seems impossible and dangerous and insane, but I can protect you. I can make sure this never happens again." "By doing what? Having us followed by bodyguards? Living our lives looking over our shoulders?" Sarah shook her head. "That's not living, Julian. That's existing in fear." "Then what do you suggest?" Julian's voice carried a note of desperation. "Because walking away from you isn't an option anymore." "Why not?" Julian looked over at Emma, who had abandoned her toys and was now standing next to him, leaning against his leg with the casual affection of a child who decided he belonged in her world. "Because," Julian said softly, his hand settling gently on Emma's head, "she called me Uncle Julian. Because she trusted me to be her prince. Because her mother showed kindness to my dying mother when she had no one else. And because," he continued, his eyes meeting Sarah's across the small room, "I'm falling in love with both of you." The words hung in the air between them, loaded with possibility and danger in equal measure. Sarah felt her heart stop, then start again with a rhythm that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with the man standing in her living room looking at her daughter like she was precious. "Uncle Julian," Emma said, tugging on his sweater, "are you going to marry Mama?" Julian's smile was swift and genuine. Would you like that, sweetheart? Yes, Emma said decisively. Then you could read me bedtime stories and teach me how to be brave like you. Sarah felt tears prick her eyes. Emma, baby, it's not that simple. Why not? Emma looked genuinely confused. Uncle Julian loves us and we love him, and love is magic, right? That's what you always tell me. Out of the mouths of babes, Sarah thought, looking between her daughter and the man who'd somehow become essential to both their lives in the space of a few days. Love was supposed to be magic. But was it magic enough to overcome the reality of Julian's world? Sarah, Julian said quietly, approaching her slowly like she was a skittish animal. I know I'm asking a lot. I know the life I can offer comes with complications and dangers you never signed up for. But I can keep you safe. I can give you both security you've never had. Financial security. You mean? Among other things. Julian stopped in front of her, close enough that she could see the gold flecks in his dark eyes. But more than that, I can give Emma a father who'll love her like she deserves. I can give you a partner who'll stand between you and anything that threatens your happiness. Sarah looked over at Emma, who was watching them with bright, interested eyes. Her daughter had been through too much change, too much upheaval. But she'd also never had a male figure in her life who treated her with the gentleness and respect Julian had shown her tonight. This is crazy, Sarah whispered. The best things usually are, Julian replied, reaching up to touch her cheek with fingers that trembled slightly. Sarah, I know this is fast. I know it seems impossible. But I spent 15 years wondering what happened to my mother, wondering if I'd ever find peace with her disappearance. You gave me that peace. You showed me that she was loved and cared for in her final days. Julian, let me finish, he said gently. You could have easily forgotten about a dying woman who had no one else. Instead, you visited her grave and sang her song to your daughter. You have the biggest heart of anyone I've ever known, and I want to spend whatever time you'll give me making sure that heart never gets broken again. Sarah felt a tear slip down her cheek. What about Emma? What about the danger? I'll handle the danger. That's what I do. I handle threats so the people I love can sleep safely at night. Julian's thumb caught her tear, wiping it away with infinite gentleness. As for Emma, I meant what I said. I want to be her father in every way that matters. I want to read her bedtime stories and teach her to be brave. I want to be there for soccer games and first dates and college graduations. You want to be her father, Sarah repeated, something warm and desperate blooming in her chest. I want to be your husband, Julian said simply. I want to wake up every morning knowing you and Emma are safe and loved. I want to build something with you that lasts forever. Sarah looked into his dark eyes and saw sincerity that couldn't be faked. This man, this dangerous, powerful man, was offering her everything she'd ever wanted and been afraid to hope for. A partner who would protect them both. A father for Emma who would cherish her. Love that felt strong enough to overcome any obstacle. The people who took Emma tonight, Sarah said slowly. Will they come back? No, Julian said with quiet certainty. They've learned that threatening you and Emma comes with consequences they're not prepared to face. And other people? Other enemies? We'll know within 24 hours that you and Emma are under Rossini protection. After tonight, anyone who threatens you is declaring war on my entire family. Sarah looked over at Emma, who had settled on the couch with her favorite book, clearly expecting a bedtime story from her newly declared Uncle Julian. Her daughter looked happy, secure, loved. For the first time in 4 years, Emma had a male figure in her life who treated her like she was precious. If I say yes, Sarah said quietly, if I let myself believe this could work, what happens next? Julian's smile was radiant. Next, I court you properly. I wine and dine you and convince you that I'm worthy of the gift you're considering giving me. I prove to Emma that I can be the father she deserves. And when you're ready, when you're sure, I ask you to marry me. And in the meantime? In the meantime, I make sure you and Emma have everything you need. Security, stability, and all the love I'm capable of giving. Sarah took a deep breath, looking around her small apartment with its peeling paint and cramped quarters. Tomorrow, Emma's asthma medication would need refilling. Next month, the rent would go up again. The car was making strange noises that probably meant expensive repairs. But more than the practical concerns, Sarah thought about the way Julian had looked when she told him about his mother. The way he'd held Emma tonight like she was precious. The way he was looking at her now, like she was the answer to every prayer he'd ever whispered in the darkness. "Okay," she said quietly. Julian went very still. "Okay?" "Okay." Sarah reached up to touch his face, feeling the slight roughness of stubble under her palm. "Court me properly, Julian Rossini. Convince me that you're worth the risk." Julian's smile was blinding. Without warning, he swept her into his arms and spun her around the small living room, his laughter rich and genuine. Emma clapped from the couch, clearly delighted with this turn of events. "I love you, Sarah McKenna," Julian said as he set her back on her feet. "I love your strength and your compassion and the way you sing lullabies in the darkness. I love that you showed kindness to my mother and that you're raising a daughter who believes in magic and princes." "I love you too," Sarah admitted, feeling like she was stepping off a cliff into free fall. "God help me, I love you too." Julian kissed her then, soft and sweet and full of promise. Over his shoulder, Sarah could see Emma grinning with satisfaction, like she'd known all along how this story would end. As Julian settled next to Emma on the couch and opened her picture book, his deep voice beginning to weave tales of brave princesses and magical kingdoms, Sarah realized that maybe her daughter had been right all along. Maybe love really was magic. And maybe, just maybe, Julian Rossini was the prince they'd both been waiting for. 3 months later, Sarah stood in the bridal suite of the Plaza Hotel, staring at her reflection in a mirror that probably cost more than she used to make in a year. The dress Julian had insisted on buying was a masterpiece of silk and lace, elegant without being ostentatious, beautiful without being flashy. It was exactly what she would have chosen if money hadn't been an object, which was somehow typical of how well Julian had come to know her. "Mama, you look like a real princess," Emma exclaimed from behind her, resplendent in her flower girl dress of soft pink silk, her strawberry blonde hair crowned with a circlet of white rosebuds. "Thank you, baby girl." Sarah turned to her daughter, marveling at how much had changed since that October night when Julian had brought Emma home safe. The nightmares had stopped. Emma had gained weight and grown 2 inches. Most importantly, she bloomed under Julian's patient attention and unwavering love. It had taken exactly 1 week for Emma to start calling him Daddy. A soft knock at the door interrupted Sarah's thoughts. "Come in," she called, expecting Julian's sister Isabella or one of the other Rossini women who had embraced Sarah with surprising warmth. Instead, Anthony Torino stepped into the room, massive in his perfectly tailored tuxedo, his usually serious expression softened with something that might have been emotion. "Anthony," Sarah said with genuine warmth. Over the past 3 months, Julian's best friend had become like a brother to her as well. The kind of man who showed up with groceries when she worked double shifts and who taught Emma card tricks when Julian was handling business. "You look beautiful, Sarah," Anthony said simply. "Julian's a lucky man." "I'm the lucky one," Sarah replied, meaning every word. The past 3 months had been a whirlwind of change, but every adjustment had been worth it for the security and love Julian had brought into their lives. "I wanted to give you something," Anthony said, pulling out a small velvet box. "It was Julian's mother's. He wanted you to have it." Sarah opened the box to reveal a delicate gold locket, clearly old and well-loved. Inside was a tiny photo of Julian as a child, laughing at something off camera, his dark eyes bright with joy. "She used to wear this every day," Anthony explained as Sarah fastened it around her neck. "Julian found it among her things at the hospital. He said she'd want you to carry a piece of her today." Sarah felt tears prick her eyes, careful not to ruin her makeup. Even now, months after learning the truth about Lucia Rossini's final days, the woman's presence seemed to bless this union she'd inadvertently created. Speaking of Julian, Anthony continued with a slight grin. "He's wearing a hole in the carpet downstairs. Man's been ready for an hour, keeps checking his watch every 30 seconds. Sarah laughed, feeling her nerves settle. "Is he nervous?" "Terrified," Anthony admitted. "Keeps asking if I think you might change your mind, if maybe this is all happening too fast, if you're really sure about marrying into this family." "And what do you tell him?" Anthony's expression grew serious. "I tell him that you're the best thing that ever happened to him and that if he screws this up, I'll kill him myself." The ceremony was small and intimate, held in the plaza's elegant terrace room with only close family and friends in attendance. Julian had wanted to give Sarah the wedding of her dreams, but she'd insisted that the important thing wasn't the size of the celebration, it was the man, waiting for her at the altar. When the doors opened and the string quartet began the wedding march, Sarah felt her breath catch at the sight of Julian. He looked devastatingly handsome in his black tuxedo, his dark hair perfectly styled, but it was the expression on his face when he saw her that made her heart race. Pure joy mixed with awe, like he couldn't quite believe his luck. Emma walked down the aisle first, scattering rose petals with the serious concentration of someone entrusted with an important job. When she reached the altar, she threw her arms around Julian's legs, and he bent to kiss the top of her head before she took her place beside Sarah's sister-in-law, Isabella. Then Sarah began her walk down the aisle, her eyes locked on Julian's, and nothing else in the world seemed to matter. "You're beautiful," Julian whispered when she reached him, his voice rough with emotion. "So are you," Sarah whispered back, taking his offered arm. The ceremony was traditional but personal, with vows they'd written themselves that spoke of protection and partnership, of building something together that would last forever. When Julian promised to love and protect both Sarah and Emma for as long as he lived, his voice carried the absolute certainty of a man who'd never made a promise he didn't keep. When Sarah promised to stand beside him through whatever challenges their life together might bring, she meant every word. She'd learned over the past 3 months that Julian's world was complicated, sometimes dangerous, but never boring. More importantly, she'd learned that his love for her and Emma was the kind of fierce, protective devotion that could overcome any obstacle. "You may kiss the bride," the officiant announced, and Julian's kiss was soft and sweet and full of promise for all the tomorrows they would share. The reception was elegant but warm, with toasts that spoke of family and new beginnings. Emma fell asleep in Julian's arms during the dancing, her face peaceful and secure against his shoulder. Sarah watched her husband sway gently to the music while holding her daughter, and felt her heart overflow with gratitude for the lullaby that had brought them all together. Later that night, in the penthouse suite Julian had booked for their wedding night, Sarah stood on the balcony looking out at the lights of Manhattan. The city spread out below them like a glittering jewel full of possibility and promise. "Any regrets?" Julian asked, coming up behind her and wrapping his arms around her waist. "None," Sarah said, leaning back against his chest. "You? Only that I didn't meet you sooner," Julian murmured, pressing a kiss to her neck that made her shiver. "If you'd met me sooner, I might not have been ready for you," Sarah pointed out. "I needed to become the person who could love you the way you deserve." Julian turned her in his arms, his dark eyes serious. "Sarah, I need you to know something. My business, my family obligations, they're not going to disappear just because we're married. There will be times when—" Sarah silenced him with a kiss, soft and lingering. "Julian, I went into this with my eyes wide open. I know who you are, what your life entails. I'm not asking you to change who you are. I'm asking you to let me be part of it, even when it's dangerous." "Even then." Sarah cupped his face in her hands. "You protect our family, Julian. You keep us safe so we can sleep peacefully at night. I understand the weight of that responsibility, and I love you for carrying it." Julian's kiss this time was deeper, hungrier, full of 3 months of careful courtship and restrained passion finally given free rein. As he lifted her in his arms and carried her toward their marriage bed, Sarah sent up a silent prayer of gratitude to Lucia Rossini, wherever she was. "Thank you," she thought, "for teaching me the lullaby that brought us together. Thank you for raising a son who knows how to love and protect. Thank you for the gift of this impossible, beautiful love story." And somewhere in the darkness of the city night, it seemed like she could almost hear an elderly woman's voice whispering back, "Take care of my boy, cara mia. He's been waiting his whole life for you to find him." 5 years after their wedding, Sarah woke to the sound of laughter from the kitchen, the familiar chaos of Sunday morning pancakes in the Rossini household. She stretched luxuriously in the king-size bed of their Westchester mansion, a home Julian had chosen specifically because it offered both security and space for their growing family. "Daddy, you're burning them." Emma's voice carried down the hallway, now 9 years old, and appointed herself the official pancake quality supervisor. "I am not burning them," Julian's voice replied with mock indignation. "I'm creating artistic golden brown perfection. That's what you said last time. And Mama had to scrape them off the pan with a spatula," came the voice of Michael Julian Rossini, their 3-year-old son who had inherited his father's dark eyes and his mother's sense of humor. Sarah smiled, pulling on her robe as she padded toward the kitchen. The scene that greeted her was one of beautiful domestic chaos. Julian at the stove wearing an apron that read, "Dad's Kitchen, flour in his hair from some mishap," while Emma stood on a step stool directing operations and little Michael sat in his high chair, his face covered in what appeared to be maple syrup. Good morning, beautiful, Julian said, abandoning the pancakes to sweep Sarah into his arms for a kiss that tasted like coffee and promises. Good morning, husband, Sarah replied, marveling as she did every day at how naturally the word fell from her lips now. How long until we need to leave for Nona Isabella's? An hour, Julian said, returning to his pancakes with the serious concentration of a man who'd learned to cook because his wife deserved Sunday morning breakfasts in bed. Plenty of time to feed the troops and get everyone presentable. Sunday dinners at Isabella Rossini's house had become a sacred tradition, the entire extended family gathering around tables that groaned under the weight of traditional Italian dishes and new American favorites. Emma was treated like a princess by her Italian aunts and uncles, while Michael was spoiled shamelessly by everyone who insisted he had the Rossini chin and his father's stubborn streak. Mama, Emma said, appearing at Sarah's elbow with the serious expression she wore when discussing important matters, can we tell everyone today? Sarah and Julian exchanged a look over Emma's head. The secret Emma was referring to was currently making. Sarah nauseous in the mornings and requiring larger scrubs at work, their third child due in the spring. What do you think, Daddy? Sarah asked, settling Michael on her hip while he chatted happily in the mixture of English and Italian he'd picked up from his extended family. Julian's smile was radiant. I think it's time, he agreed, lifting Emma onto the counter so she could help him plate the perfectly golden pancakes. But you know what this means, don't you, Princess? What? Emma asked, though her grin suggested she already knew. This means you and Michael are going to have to help me protect another little person. Being a big sister is a very important job. I'm already good at being a big sister, Emma pointed out, tickling Michael until he squealed with laughter. And I'm definitely good at protecting people. You taught me it was true. Over the past 5 years, Julian had made sure both children understood basic safety measures without scaring them. Emma knew how to use the special phone that connected directly to Anthony's security team. She understood that some people worked for Daddy to keep the family safe, and that was why there was always someone watching when she walked to school or played in the park. But most importantly, both children had grown up secure in the knowledge that they were loved beyond measure, protected fiercely, and free to believe in magic and happy endings because the adults in their lives made sure those beliefs were safely nurtured. Speaking of protecting people, Julian said, setting the last pancake on the stack, I have some news about David Chun. Sarah tensed slightly. Emma's biological father had never been a threat after Julian's intervention 5 years ago, but Sarah still felt a chill whenever his name came up. He died last week, Julian said gently. Car accident in California. It was quick, no one else was hurt, and he'd been sober for 3 years according to the reports. Sarah felt a complex mix of emotions: relief, sadness, and something that might have been forgiveness. Was he trying to get his life together? It seems like he was. Anthony's people found evidence that he'd been attending AA meetings, working construction, staying out of trouble. Whatever debt he owed to the people who used him against us, he'd apparently paid. Emma, who had been listening with the serious expression of a child who understood more than adults often realized, looked up at Julian. Does this mean I don't have a birth father anymore? You never really had one, sweetheart, Julian said gently, kneeling so he was at her eye level. A father is someone who reads you bedtime stories and teaches you to be brave and loves you no matter what. DNA doesn't make a father, love does. So you're my real father, Emma said with satisfaction. I already knew that. Julian's eyes grew bright with emotion. I've been your real father since the night I carried you home from that warehouse. You made me your father when you called me Uncle Julian and decided I belonged in your family. And now you're going to be a real father to the new baby too, Emma continued, warming to her theme. And Michael, even though he came from Mama's tummy instead of being rescued like me. That's right, Princess. Being a father isn't about how children come into your life. It's about loving them once they're there. As they ate breakfast and got ready for their family gathering, Sarah marveled at the life they'd built together. The mansion Julian had bought was filled with Emma's artwork and Michael's toys, with photographs of birthday parties and Christmas mornings and ordinary moments made precious by love. Julian had seamlessly transitioned from the most feared man in New York's underworld to a man who attended parent-teacher conferences and soccer games with equal intensity. He still handled his family's business with the same careful authority, but he'd also learned to delegate enough that he could be home for bedtime stories and Sunday morning pancakes. Ready to face the family circus? Julian asked as they loaded the children into the car, Emma chattering excitedly about announcing the new baby while Michael sang songs he'd learned from his Italian cousins. Ready, Sarah said, settling into the passenger seat and watching Julian navigate their family with the same confidence he brought to everything else. At Isabella's house, the announcement of the new baby was greeted with the enthusiastic chaos Sarah had come to expect from the Rossini family. Julian's sisters immediately began planning baby showers and arguing over godparent privileges, while his Uncle Vittorio, who had surprisingly become one of Sarah's strongest supporters after initially opposing the marriage, insisted the baby would obviously be another boy with the Rossini temperament. What do you think it will be? Isabella asked Sarah as they sat on the back patio watching Julian teach the children to play bocce ball, his patient instructions mixing English and Italian as he guided small hands in the proper throwing technique. Happy and healthy, Sarah said diplomatically. That's all that matters to me. And loved, Isabella added, watching her brother lift Michael onto his shoulders when the little boy got frustrated with the heavy ball. That baby will be so loved. It was true. This child would be born into a family that had learned love wasn't just about protection and provision. It was about showing up for soccer games and dance recitals, about Sunday morning pancakes and bedtime lullabies, about creating a safe space where children could believe in magic while learning to be strong. That night, as they tucked the children into bed, Emma asked for the lullaby that had started their whole story. Sarah sang the familiar words while Julian harmonized in his deep voice, their combined voices filling the nursery with music that spoke of love that transcended time and circumstances. Luna piena, stella bright, guard my babies through the night. Sunny dolce, dreams so sweet. Make tomorrow sunrise complete ... double quotes as the song ended and the children drifted off to sleep. Julian pulled Sarah close, his hand resting protectively over the place where their third child was growing. Any regrets? He asked, the same question he'd asked on their wedding night. Only that I can't go back and thank your mother properly, Sarah replied, leaning into his warmth. She gave me more than a lullaby, Julian. She gave me you. She gave us each other, Julian corrected, pressing a kiss to her hair. And she gave us this family, this love, this life we've built together. Outside their bedroom window, the lights of Westchester twinkled peacefully, their home nestled in security and surrounded by love. Down the hall, Emma and Michael slept safely, dreaming of dinosaurs and princesses and all the adventures tomorrow might bring. And in Sarah's heart, the lullaby continued to play the song that had brought a lonely mafia prince and a compassionate nurse together, creating a love story that proves sometimes the most beautiful music comes from the most unexpected places. Sleep well, Lucia, Sarah whispered into the darkness, a prayer of gratitude to the woman who had trusted her with a song and in doing so had given her everything she'd ever dreamed of. Your son is loved, your grandchildren are safe, and your lullaby will live on for generations to come. In response, the October wind stirred the curtains gently, carrying with it what might have been the echo of an elderly woman's voice, singing of love that conquered all, of families built from choice rather than blood, and of the magic that happened when broken hearts found their way home to each other.